1066, William the Conqueror, leader of Normandy, began to prepare for an invasion of England. He did this in the aftermath of Edward the Confessor, the King of England's, death. The brother-in-law of Edward, a man named Harold Godwinson, claimed before he passed that Edward had promised him the throne. He was coronated a day after Edward's death. William, for his part, refused to recognize Harold as king, and laid claim to the English throne through his grandfather's sister Emma, who was married to 2 consecutive English kings. William was furious at Harold's action. As to William, he had been assured the succession to the kingdom, and Harold had even sworn on holy relics to support that claim. William requested Pope Alexander II's support for an invasion against Harold, which was granted, and William immediately began preparations. William's army gathered at the mouth of the River Orne near Caen and planned to cross the English Channel over the summer of 1066. Harold knew what William was planning and gathered his army on the southern coast of England on the Island of Wight, preparing to intercept William at sea. However, William was delayed in crossing by the weather and was forced to wait for clearer skies. Simultaneously, Harold got detrimental news of a Viking fleet of 300 ships had landed in northern England, headed by a Norwegian king called Hardrada. On the 20th September, outside the town of Fulford, an English army was crushed by Hardrada, forcing Harold to march north to meet him. On the 25th of September, Harold arrived and engaged Hardrada's forces at the Battle of Stamford Bridge near York. Harold's forces prevailed after a long and bloody battle. Shortly after this victory, on the 29th of September, William's forces crossed the English Channel, landing at Pevensey on the southern coast of England. His army consisted of 6,000 to 10,000 men, 2,000 to 3,000 of which were mounted knights. After hearing of this, Harold and what remained of his army, after taking heavy losses against Hardrada, marched 250 miles to meet William in battle. Harold had around the same amount of men as William, although his army primarily consisted of infantry, while William had cavalry, infantry, and archers. On the 14th of October 1066, the battle commenced. After a brutal day of fighting, the Normans were victorious, with Harold being slain. On Christmas Day 1066, William was coronated as King of England at Westminster Abbey. While the Normans had a great victory at Hastings, William would spend the following years consolidating his power across the country, suffering many rebellions in the process. And while it did take years to establish his power, there is no evidence of a truly national movement against the Normans. Instead, there were many local rebellions against William. At times, these reached worrying proportions, with strong leaders that resisted for many years. However, some of these leaders actually ended up loyal subjects of the new king. Still, for those who did not, especially in the north of England, William's retribution was brutal even for the 11th century, and his actions have become known as the Harrying of the North. An account of the harrying, written a generation later by historian Vitalis, goes as follows. Quote, "The king stopped at nothing to hunt his enemies. He cut down many people and destroyed homes and land. Nowhere else had he shown such cruelty. He ordered that crops and herds, tools and food be burnt to ashes. More than 100,000 people perished of starvation. I have often praised William in this book, but I can say nothing good about this brutal slaughter. God will punish him." William then quickly began the process of replacing the English aristocracy with the Normans. He confiscated land for the English, giving it to his allies. By 1086, less than half a dozen of the 180 greater landlords were English. By 1090, only one of the 16 bishoprics were held by an Englishman. By the end of William the Conqueror's reign, a total of only 8% of land was in the hands of the old English aristocracy. However, not all the new aristocracy came from Normandy. Many men originated from other parts of Europe, but had fought for William in the invasion regardless. Some were Flemish in origins or from Brittany, a northwestern region of France. After taking part in the invasion, several decided to stay and build a new life in the country they had helped subdue. This change of power allowed the Normans to have greater control of English society and meant that William could reward men that had fought for him with land. By the end of the transition, around 1/5 of the land of England belonged to William himself, a quarter to the church, and nearly half to William's followers. These men would have gained a supreme amount of power, even though they constituted a small number of the population. This also meant that the Norman conquest had a much smaller impact on peasants and their day-to-day lives than compared to the ruling class. Furthermore, a lasting consequence of the decimation of the English nobility was that the French language was now used by the aristocracy and courts, and would remain as such for 2 centuries. Another way in which William subdued the English was the building of castles. The majority of these Norman castles were built with wood and earth, in the form of ringwork or motte and bailey. England was unique in Europe for the speed and scale in which these castles were built. Somewhere in the range of 500 to 600 were built across the country, with these being actively used fortifications. These had a lasting impact on the landscape, and many are still in existence today. However, some of these castles were built upon already existing lordly places, and functioned similarly to previous cultural forms of authority. It is also worth noting that this process of building did not just take place immediately after the Battle of Hastings, but continued for quite some time afterward. Furthermore, the Normans built abbeys and cathedrals on a scale never seen before in Britain. These were done in a Romanesque elegance, which over time evolved into a distinct Anglo-Norman Romanesque style. In fact, the Normans were so thorough in their reconstruction of religious buildings that nearly all pre-1066 church buildings do not survive, with all but one being razed to the ground within 50 years of the Norman conquest. The remaining church is, of course, Westminster Abbey, where William was crowned. The new Norman-style church buildings were instead used in thousands of parishes across the country. It is in the domain of construction and architecture that the Norman conquest had its biggest effect on England, with the country virtually being completely rebuilt. As the historian Garnett writes, quote, "The process of rebuilding was prosecuted with a zeal which sometimes verged on profligate recklessness." A further effect of the Norman conquest was the opening of Europe for English trade, at a size unprecedented since the Roman Empire. This occurred throughout the 11th and 12th century, and the primary exports were cloth and wool. This actually caused a mass influx of silver being brought into the country. This, combined with the rise in population, may be responsible for the mass inflation England suffered in prices and wages between the years 1199 and 1204. This inflation impacted the price of many commodities such as cloth, wine, grain, and wax. It also caused rents to fall, while costs went up. I imagine this sounds very familiar to most people. This caused many landlords to manage their own property themselves and not rent it out to tenants, as had been the norm previously. However, most of the English trade occurred in the marketplace of towns across the country, not across the English Channel. Some of these towns were set up post-conquest, such as Tewkesbury, which was set up sometime before 1086 by William's queen Matilda. Other markets were set up around Norman castles. From the 12th century onwards, markets were considered valuable financial assets, as trading rights and stalls could be sold or rented. Kings could also grant the right for towns to hold fairs, and towns began to designate certain parts for certain activities, such as the meat market held in York. The Norman dynasty that William brought to the island would continue until 1154, although English kings would rule Normandy for a further 50 years. The Norman conquest had intertwined English and French relations for centuries, with the crossover of land ownership. The legacy of this rule manifests itself in many ways in contemporary times. Cider, an extremely popular drink in England, was originally a Norman import. Furthermore, as the Normans brought with them the French language, this in turn influenced the English language. Words such as purchase, noble, and pork are loan words brought over by the Normans. Even the wildlife was impacted, with the Normans introducing rabbits to Britain. However, arguably the greatest legacy of the Normans can be seen in their architecture, which still scatters the English countryside today. And that, guys, is how William the Conqueror changed England. Thanks very much for watching, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.